The sun was sinking below the horizon, casting a hazy, golden light over the small town of Maplewood. The air was thick with the scent of freshly cut grass and the distant hum of cicadas as Officer Paul Mitchell cruised down Elm Street. The quiet hum of the patrol car's engine was the only sound that accompanied him as the suburban streets grew emptier. It was supposed to be just another uneventful evening in the town he had policed for over 15 years. But there was always something lurking under the surface. Paul liked to think he knew every street, every face, and every secret this town held. It gave him a sense of control he wasn't keen on losing anytime soon. As he approached the intersection, a sleek black SUV caught his eye. There was nothing particularly unusual about it. The car wasn't speeding, nor did it swerve or break any obvious traffic laws. Yet something in Paul's gut told him to follow it. His eyes narrowed as he watched the vehicle from a distance, a habit he had developed over the years when a car or driver didn't seem to fit. There wasn't much he could put his finger on, just a feeling. And over time, that feeling had guided him in ways he never openly admitted, not even to himself. His cruiser fell in line behind the SUV, his thumb lightly grazing the dashboard-mounted controls as he flicked on the red and blue lights. The SUV slowed to a halt just past a stop sign, its brake lights glowing ominously in the fading daylight. Paul exhaled slowly, a ritual he performed before stepping out of the car, adjusting his belt, and gripping the top of his utility belt where his hand could comfortably hover above his gun. It was a routine stop. At least, that's what it was supposed to be. As Paul approached the vehicle, his heart rate quickened. His thoughts blurred into assumptions, sharpened by years of patrols that reinforced the unconscious biases he refused to acknowledge. When the window rolled down, a familiar face greeted him, Lieutenant Marcus Hayes. Maplewood's golden boy, a decorated Army officer who had served multiple tours overseas. Hayes was well known in town, not just for his military service, but for his humility, kindness, and community service. He was the kind of guy people looked up to. But none of that mattered to Paul in this moment. "Evening, officer," Marcus greeted, his voice calm but wary. He extended his military ID without being asked, a well-rehearsed gesture for situations like this. Paul's eyes darted to the ID but lingered on Marcus' face. He felt a pang of irritation, one that wasn't entirely rational. "License and registration," he demanded, his tone sharp, cutting through the civility of the moment. Marcus blinked, a flash of confusion crossing his face. "Officer, may I ask what the issue is?" Paul ignored the question. He couldn't put his finger on it, but something about Marcus' calm demeanor irritated him. He felt a strange, irrational challenge in the man's poise, his steady eye contact. It wasn't defiance, not by any stretch, but Paul perceived it as such. He stiffened, the tension tightening across his shoulders. The air around them seemed to thicken, growing heavy with unspoken tension. The distant sound of cicadas faded as the world outside their interaction grew dim. "Step out of the vehicle," Paul ordered, his voice flat, cold. Marcus' brows furrowed, but he complied. He unbuckled his seatbelt and stepped out slowly, his military training guiding his every movement. His hands remained visible, his posture deliberate, calculated to avoid escalating a situation he'd seen play out too many times in the news. His heart raced beneath his calm exterior, and he wondered, silently, how things had gotten here. He was a soldier. He was home. He shouldn't have to feel like an enemy in his own country. "Officer Mitchell," Marcus began carefully, his tone still respectful despite the simmering anger just beneath the surface. "I'd appreciate some clarification. Why exactly have you pulled me over?" Paul's hand hovered near his gun now, a reflex he couldn't quite suppress. Something about the situation felt out of control, slipping through his fingers like sand. He had initiated the stop. He was in charge here. He needed to maintain that authority, even if he didn't know how. "You think you can ask the questions here?" Paul spat, his frustration bubbling over. "I said, step away from the vehicle." Marcus' military composure began to crack as the situation edged closer to a confrontation. "I'm standing here, not moving." "What's the problem?" You haven't given me a reason for this stop. His voice, though calm, had a firmness that bordered on defiance, but only because he was tired. Tired of these moments, of these needless confrontations, of being the one who always had to de-escalate when he wasn't the one escalating. The streetlights flickered on, casting long shadows over the unfolding scene. A few neighbors had noticed the flashing lights and began to peek from their porches, curious, cautious. Phones were pulled from pockets, their glowing screens capturing the moment that was rapidly spiraling out of control. Paul felt the weight of those eyes on him now, the pressure mounting as he tried to justify the inexplicable. His fingers tightened around the handcuffs dangling from his belt, and in a split-second decision, he moved toward Marcus. "Turn around, hands behind your back," Paul ordered, his voice shaky but firm. Marcus stood his ground. "No," he said, shaking his head. "I haven't done anything wrong. This isn't right." A crowd was beginning to gather now, whispers floating through the air. Paul could feel the shift, the energy around him growing tense, prickly, dangerous. His pulse quickened, his vision narrowing to just Marcus and the unyielding stance he had taken. With a sharp move, Paul reached for Marcus, his frustration turning into action. Marcus didn't fight, but he didn't submit either. He remained steady, firm, demanding an answer. His restraint, his refusal to yield without justification, only seemed to fuel Paul's growing frustration. The officer grappled with Marcus, struggling to assert dominance over a man who wasn't resisting but wasn't surrendering either. Then the phones went up, capturing the moment from every angle. It would be those videos that changed everything. By dawn, the streets of Maplewood were eerily silent, but online, the world was roaring. In a span of just a few hours, a video that started as a few grainy seconds of shaky footage had exploded into a full-blown firestorm. Multiple angles, different bystanders, countless retweets, shares, and comments, each adding fuel to an already blazing inferno. The once quiet town had become ground zero for a nationwide conversation about race, authority, and justice. The video was simple but damning. Marcus Hayes, a respected Army lieutenant, standing beside his car, his posture calm but firm. Officer Paul Mitchell, tense and confrontational, grappling with him as the situation escalated. Voices could be heard in the background, some pleading for calm, others murmuring in disbelief. But the camera never wavered from the heart of the incident, the moment when Marcus refused to back down, his demand for an explanation resonating with millions across the country. Justice for Marcus was trending by 8 a.m. It was surreal how quickly the world could turn. Marcus had never been one for attention, let alone the kind that came with viral fame. He sat in his kitchen that morning, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. His phone buzzed relentlessly on the table beside him, notifications pouring in from people he hadn't spoken to in years, from media outlets, from strangers who now saw him as a symbol. But Marcus wasn't interested in being a symbol. All he'd wanted was an answer. He rubbed his temples, exhausted already. It had been a sleepless night. Reporters had camped outside his house before dawn broke, the harsh glow of camera lights piercing through his window blinds like unwelcome visitors. His phone vibrated again, and with a weary sigh, he picked it up, only to see his mother's name flash across the screen. "Marcus," her voice came through, tight with worry. "Are you all right?" He nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "Yeah, Ma. I'm fine." "You don't sound fine." He exhaled slowly. "It's just, a lot. People are acting like I'm some kind of hero, but all I did was ask him to tell me why he pulled me over. That's it." His mother's voice softened. "You did more than that, son. You stood up. You stood up in a way that people haven't before, and now everyone's looking at you because they're tired of staying quiet." Marcus closed his eyes, leaning back against the kitchen chair. He didn't want to be anyone's hero. He didn't want this weight, this responsibility. But he knew his mother was right. This had become bigger than just him. Meanwhile, across town, the police department was in full-blown damage control mode. Chief Harper, an aging officer with thinning gray hair and the demeanor of someone who had seen far too much over the years, sat behind his desk with his head in his hands. Paul Mitchell had been one of his boys, a veteran on the force, someone he thought he could trust. But the footage didn't lie. Harper had watched it a dozen times now, each viewing sinking him deeper into the grim realization that this wasn't going away. The phone on his desk rang for the umpteenth time, but he ignored it. Reporters. Lawyers. Activists. They all wanted the same thing, answers. And answers were something Harper wasn't sure he could provide. Outside his office, Paul Mitchell sat alone, staring down at his own hands, the weight of the world pressing down on his chest. The quiet of the precinct was suffocating, a far cry from the bustling noise of the day before. He had made a mistake, a series of mistakes, really, but admitting that out loud felt impossible. His pride clung to his every thought, suffocating the small flickers of guilt that tried to creep in. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and he hesitated before glancing at it. Texts from old friends, most of them brief and filled with tension. "Man, you alright? This looks bad. Stay strong, bro. They'll forget about this in a week." But deep down, Paul knew this wasn't something anyone was going to forget. Not anytime soon. He had watched the videos himself, felt the rage directed at him in every comment section, in every news article. His own sister hadn't reached out yet, and that hurt more than he wanted to admit. Sarah always had a way of getting under his skin, but her silence now was deafening. Back on the streets of Maplewood, the atmosphere was rapidly changing. What had started as a few curious onlookers filming the altercation had now ballooned into something much larger. Protesters began gathering outside the police station, their signs sharp, their voices louder with each passing hour. The energy was intense, but still peaceful. People were angry, but they were organized. They demanded justice, not chaos. "Enough is enough," a woman shouted through a megaphone, her voice rippling through the growing crowd. "We've been quiet for too long." The protesters cheered in response, their signs held high. "Justice for Marcus" was scribbled in thick, black marker on dozens of them, the message clear and unyielding. Maplewood wasn't going to sleep on this. Not now. Not ever again. Inside Marcus' house, the pressure was building. He hadn't left his home since the video went viral, but he knew he couldn't hide forever. His phone buzzed once more, this time a text from an old army buddy. "Saw the video, man. Proud of you for standing up. But be careful. These people aren't gonna stop until you're on the front page of every paper in the country." Marcus read the message, feeling the weight of his friend's words. He was caught between wanting to retreat back into the quiet life he had known and recognizing that he no longer had that option. The video had changed everything. People saw him as a voice for those who had been silenced, as someone who could speak truth to power. But Marcus hadn't asked for this role. He was a soldier. He was trained for combat, for survival, for defense. Not for this. Not for the limelight. But still, he knew he had to face it. The protesters outside, the reporters camped on his lawn, the flood of messages, they weren't going away. And maybe, just maybe, there was something bigger at play here, something he couldn't walk away from even if he wanted to. As the day wore on, the pressure on Paul Mitchell escalated too. His superiors had asked him to take leave while the department conducted its internal review. But everyone knew what that meant. Paul was being hung out to dry. The public was demanding his head, and the department would likely give it to them just to keep the peace. He sat alone in his car, parked at the edge of town, staring out at the horizon. The sun was setting again, casting a deep orange glow over the fields beyond. Paul's thoughts raced. Regret gnawed at the edges of his mind, but it wasn't strong enough to eclipse the anger, the defensiveness that still simmered in his chest. How had it come to this? He had been doing his job. That's what he told himself over and over. He had done what any officer would have done in that situation. But as the sun dipped lower, his resolve weakened. The truth was creeping in, and it scared him. As the day turned to night, the town of Maplewood stood on the precipice of something far bigger than anyone could have imagined. The viral video had set the stage, but the real battle was just beginning. Protests were growing, and with them, the tension that had long simmered beneath the surface of this quiet town was finally boiling over. The noise outside the police station had died down as evening fell, but the tension in Maplewood remained thick. The once quiet streets now hummed with an anxious energy, like the air before a thunderstorm. The viral video had cast a long shadow over the town, and it was clear that no one was escaping unscathed, not Marcus, not Paul Mitchell, and certainly not the town itself. It was into this storm that Sarah Mitchell stepped, though her return to Maplewood had not been part of any plan. The moment she saw the video of her brother on her phone, her stomach twisted in knots. The Paul she remembered wasn't the man she saw in that footage, the man gripping his gun with tension written in every line of his body, coldly ordering Marcus out of his car. He had been different once, different to her, at least. But even back then, there were signs. Sarah hadn't been back to Maplewood in almost 5 years. She had left the town behind, along with her brother, moving to the city to escape the small-mindedness she had felt suffocating her as a teenager. She had built a life as a civil rights attorney, fighting in courts for justice and equality, for people who needed a voice. And now, ironically, the person she was up against was her own flesh and blood. The road leading into Maplewood was lined with trees, their branches thick and tangled, casting long shadows across the asphalt. As Sarah drove toward the town center, her mind raced. Memories of her childhood here, of the shared history between her and Paul, flooded her thoughts. The Mitchell family had never been particularly close, but what little bond they had seemed to crumble completely when Sarah left. Paul had stayed behind, stayed loyal to the town, loyal to the badge, even as the world around them changed. And that loyalty had come at a cost. Sarah parked her car a few blocks from the police station, choosing to walk the rest of the way. She didn't want to be noticed just yet. She wasn't ready for the whispers of old neighbors or the pointed looks from people who hadn't forgotten the girl who left town and never looked back. The plan was simple: meet Marcus. Offer him help. Then confront Paul. Marcus was sitting at a local diner when Sarah finally found him. He looked exhausted, his eyes dark from sleepless nights and the constant barrage of media attention. The booth he sat in was tucked away in a corner, but even here, people occasionally glanced over at him, recognizing the man from the viral video. The weight of being a symbol was heavy on his shoulders. As Sarah slid into the booth across from him, Marcus looked up, his brows furrowing in confusion. "Marcus Hayes?" Sarah's voice was calm, but her eyes were sharp, analyzing every nuance of his demeanor. She had seen too many cases to not read a person within the first few minutes of meeting them. "Yeah," Marcus responded, his voice hoarse. "And you are?" "I'm Sarah Mitchell," she said, letting the name hang in the air for a moment. She didn't wait for the connection to click before continuing. "I saw the video. I'm a civil rights attorney, and I want to represent you." Marcus blinked, the name still turning over in his mind. "Mitchell, as in Paul Mitchell?" Sarah nodded. "He's my brother." A wave of emotions passed over Marcus' face: confusion, anger, disbelief. "Your brother is the one who pulled me over." "I know," she said, her voice soft but steady. "I didn't come here to defend him. I came here to help you." Marcus studied her face for a moment, searching for any sign of deception, but he found none. There was no trick here, no ulterior motive, just a woman standing on the other side of a complicated line, caught between family and justice. "You think he's gonna let this go quietly?" Marcus asked, leaning back in his seat. His tone wasn't accusatory, just matter of fact. Sarah exhaled slowly. "No, Paul doesn't let things go. But he's not the person I grew up with either. I'm here to find out why, and to make sure you get the justice you deserve." There was a pause, the weight of Sarah's words hanging between them. Marcus finally nodded, though it was clear he was still unsure what to make of the situation. "You're willing to go up against your own brother for this?" "I'm not going up against Paul," Sarah corrected, her voice cool and measured. "I'm going up against what he's become." Later that night, Sarah made her way to Paul's house, a small, unremarkable two-story that sat on the edge of town. The driveway was empty, save for Paul's patrol car parked in front. She could see the light from the living room filtering through the curtains, casting a faint glow on the front porch. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stood there, staring at the house that once felt like home. It didn't feel like that anymore. Not after everything that had happened. Not after everything she had learned about who Paul had become. After a moment, she forced herself forward, climbing the steps and knocking on the door. It took a minute before Paul opened it, and when he did, his expression shifted from surprise to a guarded, almost defensive stance. His eyes hardened as soon as he saw her, the tension between them palpable. "Sarah?" Paul's voice was thick with disbelief. "What the hell are you doing here?" "I came to talk," Sarah replied, her voice firm but not unkind. "We need to have this conversation, Paul. Whether you like it or not." Paul stepped back, opening the door wider to let her in, but the hostility in his body language was clear. His eyes never softened, and his jaw was clenched tight. "I figured you'd show up sooner or later," Paul said as he closed the door behind her. "I saw the video. I knew it would get to you." Sarah didn't respond immediately. She took a moment to look around the living room, at the worn couch, the faded photos on the walls, the TV flickering in the background. It was the same house she remembered, but something about it felt empty. Like a museum to the past. "You've really gone all in on this cop thing, haven't you?" Sarah asked, her voice carrying a bite of sarcasm she couldn't quite suppress. Paul shot her a look, but said nothing. His silence was louder than words. They sat down, though neither looked particularly comfortable. Paul leaned forward, elbows on his knees, while Sarah sat back, arms crossed. "What happened to you, Paul?" Sarah asked, cutting straight to the point. "The man in that video, who is he?" "Because he's not the brother I remember." Paul's jaw tightened. "Don't lecture me, Sarah. You left. You ran off to the city, and now you think you can come back here and tell me how things are? You don't know what it's like anymore." Sarah shook her head. "You're right, I left. But this isn't about me. This is about you and what you did. Paul, you're on the wrong side of this." Paul's face hardened further. "I was doing my job." "No," Sarah snapped, her voice rising slightly. "You weren't. You were acting out of fear. Out of prejudice. And you know it." There was a long silence. For a moment, Paul looked like he might snap back at her, but something in his sister's words struck a nerve. He looked away, his shoulders slumping ever so slightly. "I don't know how things got like this," Paul finally muttered, his voice softer now. "But this town, it's different. People are different. I'm just trying to protect it." "Protect it from what?" Sarah asked quietly. "From people like Marcus? From people who just want to live without fear of being targeted? That's not protection, Paul. That's control." Paul didn't answer. The weight of Sarah's words pressed down on him, and for the first time in years, he felt doubt. As Sarah left her brother's house that night, she knew the battle ahead was only just beginning. Paul wasn't ready to admit his faults, but the cracks were starting to show. And in those cracks, there was hope that he could change. But even if he didn't, Sarah was ready to fight for Marcus, for justice, and for all the people who had been wronged by the system her brother had chosen to defend. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with anticipation. Every seat was filled, with more people standing along the back wall, leaning forward as if proximity would offer them some sort of insight or control over the proceedings. The press sat in the front rows, their pens and cameras at the ready, eager to capture every moment. Outside, protesters lined the courthouse steps, their voices barely muffled by the thick stone walls. Marcus Hayes sat at the defense table, his military posture as rigid as ever, though his eyes betrayed a weariness that had settled in since the night of the incident. Beside him was Sarah Mitchell, her face calm but alert, scanning the room with the sharpness of a hawk. She had prepared for this moment meticulously, piecing together every thread of evidence that pointed not just to her brother's misconduct, but to the broader systemic issues that plagued Maplewood. Across the aisle sat Paul Mitchell, flanked by his defense attorney, a stone-faced man named Wallace Brinkman. Paul looked drained, his usual confidence replaced with an uneasy mix of defiance and doubt. He wore his police uniform, which felt like a thin layer of armor now, one that was no longer enough to protect him from the scrutiny he was under. The trial had already drawn attention from across the country, with news outlets broadcasting updates by the hour. This wasn't just a small-town dispute anymore, it had become a national conversation about race, power, and justice. And now, everyone was watching. The judge, an older man with a stern face and piercing blue eyes, entered the room and sat down. He banged the gavel, silencing the room. This court is now in session. The first witness was Marcus Hayes himself. As Marcus took the stand, the room held its collective breath. Sarah stood beside him, ready to guide the questioning. Her voice was steady, sharp, but not aggressive. "Lieutenant Hayes," she began, "could you describe for the court the events of the night you were pulled over by Officer Mitchell?" Marcus took a deep breath. "I was driving home after visiting my family. It was a normal evening, nothing out of the ordinary. I wasn't speeding. I wasn't swerving. Then I noticed the police lights behind me." Sarah nodded, prompting him to continue. "What happened next?" "I pulled over, as anyone would. When Officer Mitchell approached my vehicle, I immediately handed him my military ID, as well as my driver's license. I've done that before to help ease situations, to show that I'm no threat." "And how did Officer Mitchell respond?" Sarah asked, pacing slowly in front of the jury, her gaze never leaving Marcus. "He asked me to step out of the vehicle," Marcus replied, his voice calm, though the memory clearly brought back tension. "I asked him why, but he didn't answer. He just kept ordering me to step out, getting more aggressive as time went on." "And did he ever provide a clear reason for pulling you over?" Marcus shook his head. "No. To this day, I still don't know what I did to warrant being pulled over." Sarah paused, letting Marcus' words sink into the courtroom. Then she walked slowly toward the jury. "Lieutenant Hayes, do you believe you were treated differently because of the color of your skin?" There was a heavy silence. Marcus hesitated for a moment, but then he looked up, meeting the eyes of every juror. "Yes," he said quietly but firmly. "I've been pulled over before for nothing. But it was always different, until I met Officer Mitchell." Next came Paul Mitchell's turn to take the stand. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as Paul made his way to the witness stand, his face pale under the harsh courtroom lights. He glanced once at Sarah, who sat back, watching him intently. This was no longer just a legal battle, it was personal. The courtroom felt like a battlefield, with Paul and Sarah on opposite sides, despite the blood they shared. Wallace Brinkman, Paul's defense attorney, began his questioning with an air of calculated calm. He walked Paul through the procedural steps of a traffic stop, making it clear that officers have the right to pull someone over and ask them to step out of their vehicle if they feel it's necessary. He painted Paul as a man just doing his job, following protocol in what could have been a dangerous situation. "Officer Mitchell," Brinkman said, "why did you pull over Lieutenant Hayes that night?" Paul cleared his throat, his voice sounding rougher than usual. "The vehicle fit the description of a car that had been reported earlier that day in connection with some suspicious activity. It was a routine stop." Sarah stood up, preparing for cross-examination. "Officer Mitchell," she began, her voice cutting through the courtroom like a blade. "You said the vehicle matched a description. Yet, there are no records of any such report being filed that day. Can you explain that discrepancy?" Paul shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting toward Brinkman for support. I may have been mistaken about the timing of the report. But I was still within my rights to pull him over." Sarah nodded, feigning agreement for a moment. Then she stepped closer, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Officer Mitchell, isn't it true that you've been reprimanded before for disproportionately stopping black drivers?" Isn't it true that this wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a larger pattern of behavior? Paul's face flushed with anger. I've never. Answer the question, Officer Mitchell, Sarah interrupted, her voice now sharp. The courtroom went silent, every eye on Paul. After a long pause, Paul exhaled, deflating slightly. There were a couple of complaints in the past, but those were investigated, and I was cleared. Sarah leaned in, pressing forward. Cleared by an internal review. But the fact remains, you have a history of disproportionately targeting people of color. Isn't that right? Paul looked down at his hands, the weight of his actions pressing down on him like a heavy cloak. He didn't answer. The silence was louder than any words he could have spoken. As the trial progressed, Sarah meticulously built her case, calling in witnesses who spoke to Paul's history of racial profiling. She brought in experts on racial bias in policing, who testified about how unconscious bias can influence an officer's behavior in situations just like the one Marcus had faced. With every piece of evidence, every pointed question, she dismantled the defense's argument bit by bit. But the most explosive moment came when Sarah, in a bold move, called Paul back to the stand for one final, unexpected confrontation. Officer Mitchell, she began, her voice steady but now carrying the weight of their shared history. I want to ask you one last question, as your sister. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Do you believe, Sarah said quietly, that your actions were influenced by the color of Marcus Hayes' skin? Paul hesitated, his jaw tight, his eyes flicking to the jury, then back to his sister. For a moment, it looked like he would lash out, would deny everything. But then his shoulders slumped. He looked down at his lap, his hands clenched into fists. I don't know, he whispered, his voice hoarse. Maybe. Sarah's face softened, but her tone remained professional. That's all, Your Honor. The jury deliberated for hours, each minute stretching into an eternity for those waiting. Inside the courthouse, people whispered, speculating about what the verdict would be. Outside, the protests had swelled once again, their chants echoing through the streets of Maplewood. When the jury finally returned, the tension in the room was so thick it felt like the air itself had been replaced with something heavier, something harder to breathe. The foreman stood, holding the small slip of paper that would determine the outcome. We, the jury, find the defendant, Officer Paul Mitchell, guilty of misconduct and wrongful arrest. The courtroom erupted, a mixture of gasps, whispers, and quiet cheers. Outside, the crowd broke into applause, their voices raised in a collective sigh of relief. For Marcus, there was no joy in the verdict, only the quiet satisfaction that justice, however imperfect, had been served. Paul sat frozen in his seat, staring blankly ahead. His world had just crumbled around him. Everything he had built, his reputation, his career, was in ruins. And though he hadn't been sentenced to prison, the punishment was clear. He would never be the same man again. As Marcus and Sarah left the courthouse, walking out into the bright sunlight, Marcus turned to her, his expression unreadable. What now? He asked. Sarah smiled faintly, her eyes tired but determined. Now, we keep fighting. Maplewood was quiet, but not in the way it had been before. It was a different kind of silence now, one filled with reflection, not avoidance. The trial had shaken the town to its core, leaving everyone to reckon with the truth of what had always been simmering beneath the surface. Marcus Hayes sat on his porch, the warm evening air brushing against his skin. The weight of the trial was still with him, but there was a sense of closure he hadn't felt in months. The verdict had been a victory, yes, but it didn't feel like a celebration. It felt more like the end of a chapter, one that had opened a long time ago. He glanced at his phone, where messages from fellow soldiers, friends, and strangers continued to pour in. Some congratulated him for standing his ground, others offered their own stories of injustice. But none of it felt like enough. The system that had failed him, and so many others, was still in place. This victory was just one small crack in a wall that had stood for far too long. The front door creaked open, and Sarah stepped out onto the porch, 2 cups of coffee in hand. She handed one to Marcus and sat down beside him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The weight of everything they had been through was shared, understood without words. "Feels strange, doesn't it?" Marcus finally said, staring out at the quiet street. "It's over, but it doesn't feel like it is." Sarah nodded. "It's not. This is just the start of something bigger." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the hum of the night filling the space between them. The trial had been hard on both of them, Sarah, for confronting her brother, and Marcus, for being thrust into the center of a national conversation about race and justice. But despite the exhaustion, there was a sense of quiet determination between them. They both knew this fight wasn't over. Paul Mitchell, on the other hand, had vanished from public life almost entirely. After the verdict, he had been suspended from the police force indefinitely, pending mandatory racial bias training and further investigation into his conduct. For many in town, it wasn't enough. They wanted him fired, stripped of his badge, made to pay more directly for his actions. But for Paul, the punishment wasn't just in the form of official discipline. The real punishment was internal. He sat alone in his small, dimly lit living room, staring blankly at the television. The news was on, showing coverage of the trial's aftermath, but the sound was muted. It was all too much. The weight of everything, the shame, the guilt, the anger at himself, pressed down on him, leaving him unable to move, unable to think clearly. The trial had forced him to confront parts of himself he had spent years burying. The questions Sarah had asked, the accusations, the evidence, it had all peeled back layers of who he thought he was, leaving behind something he didn't recognize. He had always seen himself as a good man, a man who upheld the law, who protected his town. But now, that image was shattered. His phone buzzed on the table, the screen lighting up with a text from Sarah. He stared at it for a long moment before picking it up. "We need to talk." Paul hesitated, his thumb hovering over the keyboard. He knew this conversation was inevitable, but he wasn't ready. He didn't know if he would ever be ready. But before he could think too much, he typed a quick response. "I know." The town of Maplewood was also beginning to change, though slowly, like a heavy train just starting to move. The protests that had begun after the video went viral hadn't stopped, but they had evolved. What had once been marches of anger and frustration were now gatherings of hope and determination. People were no longer just protesting, they were organizing. Marcus, despite his reluctance to take on a leadership role, found himself at the forefront of a movement. He worked closely with local activists, meeting with community leaders, police officers, and citizens from all backgrounds to discuss ways to improve relations between law enforcement and the town's Black residents. It wasn't easy. There was resistance, old ways of thinking that didn't want to bend to the pressure for change. But progress, however slow, was being made. Town hall meetings became a regular occurrence, with citizens and police officers sitting side by side to have honest conversations. People who had never spoken about race or injustice before were now grappling with difficult questions. It was messy, uncomfortable, but necessary. One evening, after yet another town hall, Marcus found himself walking through the streets of Maplewood alone. The quiet of the town, which had once felt oppressive, now seemed full of potential. He passed the diner where he had first met Sarah, the place where this all had started. It felt like a lifetime ago. A familiar voice called out to him from across the street. Chief Harper was standing outside the police station, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his face etched with exhaustion. He crossed the street slowly, coming to stand in front of Marcus. "Lieutenant," Harper said, nodding in acknowledgement. He looked older now, as if the events of the past few weeks had aged him years. "I've been meaning to catch up with you." Marcus gave him a curt nod. There was no warmth between them, but there was respect. "I've been with the department for 30 years, Harper continued, his voice low. "Thought I'd seen it all. But this," he shook his head. "This was different." Marcus didn't respond, waiting for the chief to finish. "We've made a lot of mistakes," Harper admitted. "And it's gonna take a long time to fix it." But I wanted you to know, we're trying. Marcus studied the older man for a moment, searching his face for sincerity. Finally, he nodded. That's all we can ask for. As Harper turned to leave, Marcus called after him. Chief. Harper turned back. We need more than trying, Marcus said firmly. We need change. Harper nodded, a flicker of something, hope, maybe, passing over his face. We're working on it, Lieutenant. We're working on it. Sarah and Paul finally met at the edge of town, in the park they used to play in as kids. The swing set was old now, rusted and creaking in the wind. Paul sat on one of the swings, staring down at the ground as Sarah approached. For a long time, neither of them spoke. I don't know where to start, Paul finally muttered, his voice thick with emotion. I messed up, Sarah. I know that now. Sarah sighed, her breath visible in the cool evening air. I didn't come here to hear an apology. I came here to tell you that you can still change. Paul looked up at her, his eyes tired. I don't know if I can. What if it's too late? Sarah shook her head, her expression softening. It's never too late. But it won't be easy. The wind blew softly, carrying the scent of pine and earth, a reminder of the simpler times they had shared before everything had gone wrong. Paul knew she was right. It wouldn't be easy, nothing about this was easy. But it was possible. Where do I start? He asked quietly, almost to himself. By listening, Sarah said. By recognizing that you don't have all the answers. And by doing the work to change. Paul nodded, and for the first time in months, he felt something shift inside him. It wasn't a fix, and it wasn't redemption. But it was a start. The town of Maplewood wasn't perfect, and it never would be. But it had been cracked open, its flaws exposed to the light. And now, for the first time, people were willing to look at them, to confront them, and maybe, just maybe, to change them. For Marcus, Sarah, and even Paul, the journey was just beginning. But it was a journey they were ready to face, together and apart, knowing that the road to justice is long and winding, but always worth walking.